The tension between Russia and Ukraine is continuing to escalate. Late in 2021, Russia began deploying big numbers of troops close to Ukraine's borders, while repeatedly denying it was going to attack. Then Mr. Putin scrapped a 2015 peace deal for the East, and recognized areas under rebel control as independent. After a day of lashing out at NATO, Putin made an explosive announcement on state television: "I think it is necessary to make a long overdue decision, to immediately recognize the impedance and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic." Russia has deployed its soldiers and tanks in the separatist areas of Ukraine. Airports and military headquarters were hit first, near cities across Ukraine, then tanks and troops rolled into Ukraine, from the north, east, and south, from Russia and its ally Belarus. The civilians of Ukraine, the common people, are now being given training for bearing arms, because of the threat of an impending war. Vladimir Putin announced the move in an unscheduled TV address. He said that Russia would bring in troops. He told the Ukrainian troops to lay down arms and go home. Any attempt to interfere with this Russian action would lead to consequences they have never seen. He claimed his goal was to protect people subjected to bullying and genocide, and aim for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. There has been no genocide in Ukraine. It is a vibrant democracy, led by a president who is Jewish. So, what's the real agenda behind the invasion? To understand this crisis fully, we need to take a deeper look at history, and a peek into the head of the man behind all of this, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. So let's start with a bit of history. In the 9th century AD, all the Eastern Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic people were around Kiev, under an entity called Kievan Rus, or Land of the Rus people. Rus is where Russia today derives its name from, and the Ukraine region is thus the cultural ancestor of the current countries of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So it's evident that Ukraine and Russia have shared history going back to over 1,000 years. Here's the key part. Their respective cultures gradually grew distinct, with the Russian Empire being based in Moscow. While Ukraine was a separate republic within the USSR, and in a referendum conducted in 1991, over 90% of Ukrainians had voted for independence from the USSR. But what prompted this latest round of hostilities? Russia has always been disturbed by the advancement of NATO right on its borders. But since the fall of the USSR, NATO expanded by about 14 countries, including countries right on the Russian borders, like Latvia and Lithuania. And lately, there was a lot of chatter on NATO expanding to indulge Ukraine, which seems to have irked Russia. Russia has never liked the fact that Ukraine, one of the closest neighbors, has drastically shifted towards the West in the past decade. Russia has long resisted Ukraine's move towards the European Union, and the West's defensive military alliance, NATO. Ukraine is seeking a clear timeline to join NATO. Russia's deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov explained, "For us, it's absolutely mandatory to ensure Ukraine never, ever becomes a member of NATO." President Putin has also argued that if Ukraine joined NATO, the alliance might try to recapture Crimea. He earlier complained, Russia had nowhere further to retreat to. Do they think we'll just sit idly by? Announcing Russia's invasion, he accused NATO of threatening their historic future as a nation. Let's imagine Ukraine as a NATO member and starts these military operations. Are we supposed to go to war with the NATO bloc? Has anyone given that any thought? Apparently not. Said by Vladimir Putin, Russian president. President Putin, who once called the collapse of the USSR the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, seems to have a civilizational view, due to which he wants to unite Ukraine and Russia, by force if necessary. His worldview was confirmed by the speech he gave the day before, where he said that Ukraine is an artificial creation, and defied its right to statehood. President Putin has frequently accused Ukraine of being taken over by extremists, ever since its pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted in 2014, after months of protests against his rule. Russia then retaliated by seizing the southern region of Crimea, and triggering a rebellion in the east, backing separatists, who have fought Ukrainian forces, in a war that has claimed 14,000 lives. In 2014, he captured Crimea. And the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk were broken apart from Ukraine. Russia supported the separatists there. They sent their military there, and the war that broke out led to new boundary lines being drawn. Russia has tried to help these two separatist areas, as much as possible, by giving them military support, financial support, as much as providing COVID vaccines to them. The 800,000 people living there were issued Russian passports by Russia. But Russia is not just focused on Ukraine. It demands that NATO return to its pre-1997 borders. Mr. Putin wants NATO to remove its forces and military infrastructure from member states that joined the alliance from 1997, and not to deploy strike weapons near Russia's borders. That means Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Baltics. In President Putin's eyes, the West promised back in 1990 that NATO would expand, not an inch to the east, but did so anyway. That was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, so the promise made to then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev only referred to East Germany, in the context of a reunified Germany. Mr. Gorbachev said later, the topic of NATO expansion was never discussed at the time. What's NATO's status regarding this? NATO is a defensive alliance, with an open-door policy to new members, and its 30 member states are adamant that will not change. There is no prospect of Ukraine joining for a long time, as Germany's chancellor has made clear. But the idea that any current NATO country would give up its membership is a non-starter. NATO has deployed their military. 5,000 NATO troops have been deployed to Poland, 4,000 can be sent to countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Slovakia. But these are the NATO countries. Ukraine is not a part of NATO countries. So even if Ukraine is attacked, the chances are that NATO will not interfere with that. But it's for sure that NATO has tried to help Ukraine in some other ways by providing weapons, advanced weaponry, providing them financial help. The threat now is that Putin wouldn't stop here. The European countries and the USA fear that Putin is trying to capture Ukraine's entire country. What are your thoughts on this crisis? Let us know in comments. If you found this video helpful, do hit a like and subscribe our channel for further updates.